Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Darbar Hall. I would like to begin by asking, how many of you believe in ghosts with a show of hands? Okay. How many of you have seen a ghost but still don't believe in a ghost and you have a story? Show of hands. Okay, nobody's seen a ghost. But how many of you have heard a ghost story while growing up? Almost all of you. It is these stories of ghosts, the specters, the other world that we will be touching upon because Daisy's just come out with the most fantastic, to me, oddly cozy novel called Alice Sees Ghosts. But because we are starting with stories, I want to begin with that, Daisy. Your first whiff of literature, the written world. What was it while growing up that drew you towards the world of stories and then finally took you on to translate, to write, and to be who you are?
So I grew up in a family of artists, all visual artists, but they all were voracious readers. And the custom in my father's family was to read aloud as much as possible. So my parents both read aloud to me from a very early age. And my father loved to read Dickens aloud, which I know sounds very old-fashioned, but his father had, and his mother had read that aloud to him. And his father, who was a famous painter, Norman Rockwell, he always had his wives, he was married 3 times, but, serially. He had his wives read aloud to him while he was painting. So he had War and Peace read aloud to him twice by my grandmother. So anyway, this is just a really strong tradition in my family, is reading aloud and sharing thoughts about literature. So I don't remember a time without that. Yeah.
Talking about families then, we can get to Alice and her ghosts now. In Alice Sees Ghosts, we are talking about this woman, Alice, who sees the ghost of a family member in a house that has her own mother and her grandmother. When we talk about horrors, we will talk about the supernatural entity that is haunting Alice and her dreams in this book. But do you think when you were writing and structuring the story, the house that you've placed Alice in, with her grandmother and her mother, and of course her doting fiancé, at that point, when there are these range of troubles that all 3 women seem to be going through, do we see, or were you trying to build on the idea of the sort of horrors that we inherit through family, through generations, which are not supernatural but are also quite traumatic because we enter into this house and we feel that sense of heaviness in the beginning?
Yeah, well, we can think of those intergenerational horrors. We can think of them psychologically, and in fact, her fiancé, Ronit, is a psychiatrist, but we can also think of them kind of as supernatural inheritance, because this is the kind of house that a family has lived in for generations, and I think anybody who's been in that kind of house, you feel the hauntings just from the objects that were left behind by previous generations. So it is, I think, a haunted house, and it's haunted both by actual ghosts and by these psychological burdens.
And now talking about the supernatural entity, what was it about the spectre that made you want to write a story that bases itself on the ghost of a grandfather who lures Alice in, and she goes on this adventure, which we don't want to give any spoilers, but it is a very wild, adventurous ride. Why the trope of the ghost? What was your reason for bringing this element in?
Well, in some ways, she's feeling very traumatized because her beloved grandmother is on her deathbed in this house that's also very beloved to her. And her mother is a difficult character who's an alcoholic. And so she's sort of penned in by these pressures. And she starts to, I think, kind of receive messages from beyond. It's partly for her liberating. It's like, so for other people it would be scary to suddenly come upon a ghost, but she actually seeks him out. She has a sense that there's a ghost. She feels like there's a ghost, and she goes looking for him night after night. So she finds it actually comforting. He's more comforting than what she's confronting among the living.
So Alice in the book is in this home, and as Daisy just said, her grandmother is counting her days. She's very sick. She's dealing with an alcoholic mother, and she sees the ghost of her grandfather in his library, and he's a very well-read ghost. A lot of people in this book are obsessed with the arts and the humanities. We see her fiancé, Ronit, who's actually a doctor, also come from a family of artists, of writers, of thinkers. That was something that really stood out because we grow up, for a lot of us, especially in South Asia, with the idea that, well, these are extracurricular at one point of time. That's what they were called. Now they are called co-curricular because you do it with academia. But I found it very interesting how central the role of the arts is in the book, and I'm sure it's an extension of all the work that you do. How important was it for you to situate a ghost story within a set of people in whom you would find a believer?
Well, some people, when this book first was announced, they said, "Oh, Daisy, I didn't expect you to write speculative fiction." And I was surprised because I didn't think I had written speculative fiction. And I said that to one friend, and he said, "Well, then, what did you write?" Because it's obviously the ghosts in the title. And I said, well, I was brought up to believe in ghosts, so I think it's realism, basically. And so I was brought up, in fact, to believe in ghosts. And I remember my grandmother died when I was about 3 in a very horrible way. And I was scared to turn off the light at night. And I was lying in bed, and my mother came to put me to bed, and she, and I told her I was scared of ghosts. And she said, "Oh, you don't need to be scared of ghosts, because when they show up, they just have certain things they need to get done. So you just say, 'Hello, well, how can I help you?' And then you just find a way to help them out, and then they'll go on their way." So, of course, this was not comforting to me. And I slept with the lights on for a long time. But there are even stories in my family of that same grandmother showing up as a ghost. And this was seen by a real estate agent on her property. She showed up supposedly in full black riding habit on side saddle on a horse, and she waved at some potential buyers that she didn't like, and they ran off the property. So this is this is reality for me, and as well as living and growing up in an environment where there's absolutely no math or science or STEM fields, and completely and totally saturated by art and literature and nothing else. Yeah.
How fun. So in the book, we see Alice, whose fiancé, Ronit, is very keen on her traveling to India, and to these places in India where she finds these addresses, and it's a bit complicated. You'll read the book and you'll find out, because they go from Muzaffarnagar to Mussoorie in their search of many questions. When we see Ronit reach India and we have the family meet her for the first time, Ronit's mom and dad, it was at that point where I thought it is so refreshing to see how the parents, who both come from an arts background, sort of be like, Ronit does not believe in ghosts because, well, he's a doctor. And your dad, Ronit, is a literature professor. Of course, he has to believe in ghosts. So it is an oddity for Ronit to not believe in ghosts. But Ronit loves Alice, and he would do anything for her. I mean, I was so envious reading the book, because you do not really get lovers and men like these anymore. But Ronit seems to be an exception. I want to go into now both Ronit and Alice as characters. I want to first speak about Ronit, because he is drawn to a very reserved woman. When you were writing about Ronit and his love for Alice, what and who did you have in your mind?
Wait, say that part again.
So Ronit is in love with a
Right.
woman who's very reserved with her
Right.
emotions. She really holds back. When you were drawing up the character of Ronit, what were some of the qualities that you were putting in him that lured him towards Alice and had him, and he was convinced that this is the woman that he wants to marry because he is so expressive, whereas Alice is on the other end of the spectrum, so there is a sort of contradiction over there. What brings them together as these diverse characters?
So, I mean, there's one sort of superficial thing, which is that he had a cousin, an NRI cousin, who had come to visit one summer with some VHS tapes of the Winter Olympics, and they watched these skating things over and over again. So once is his kind of superficial, in a way, childhood infatuation with these figure skating stars, and Alice is kind of like an ice queen in a way. She's a New England wasp, and so the New England wasps are known to be chilly people. And so that's sort of, I think, on the superficial level, what draws him to her. But also, because he's a psychiatrist, I think he's sort of fascinated by her detachment and her kind of her like difficult psychological problems, and so he's a bit of a caretaker type of person, obviously, too. So he's just completely drawn to her, and also, of course, there's that way in which somebody that feels inaccessible is always somebody that you want to reach for. So there's that quality in Alice too.
When you read the book and you read about Alice, in your mind she emerges as a ghost herself. For me, I was always thinking of this shadowy, dainty figure, and again, inaccessible, but both physically too. I would feel like if you touch her, she would just break because there were so many things that she was dealing with. However, when we were talking before, you said that you drew up her qualities of reserving herself as a strength rather than a weakness. And we do see her be quite courageous at different points, even when you feel like she may collapse because of everything that she's going through. Do you think her attitude towards life is her strength?
Yeah, I think part of her reserve is she's protecting herself from her mother, from her dysfunctional mother, and so she has to kind of build a wall around herself. And if you remember, there's one line where her mother refers to her as a goddamn independent nation state. Like their mother finds her inaccessible too, and very frustrated that she can't relate to her, but also can't kind of invade her space. Yeah.
So she sets her boundaries very well, Alice. A very fun quality about the book are the very descriptive scenes that you come across, especially Alice's adventures in India. You can smell those times when she wants to get off the bus and have chole bhature, and then obviously she has a stomach sickness because, that's what you get. But Daisy, I want to go back now to you as the writer and your experiences. Of course, to write about India in such a way has to come from your own history, your own adventures in India years ago. Tell us about that. Tell us about your first time in India, and then we're going to take them to Alice and her first time in India.
So I think that one of the big challenges of this book was I didn't want it to be an eat, pray, love book, right? So I didn't want it to be white woman goes to India and finds enlightenment. So I had to think very carefully, yes, drawing on my own experiences and being hyper aware of how I was depicting everything. And not exoticizing everything. So my first trip to India was supposed to be a study abroad, but it was poorly organized, and there were only 2 of us on it, and we were told, just sort of given instructions to go land in Delhi and then go to this hotel, but the hotel had no room, and we were left at the American Institute for Indian Studies where we had to sleep on the sofa, and then we were stuck in another hotel, and we literally didn't know where we were, and this is 1989, so there was no internet and no phones. We had a paper map, and we walked out of the hotel and down the street looking at the street signs to try to figure out what part of Delhi we were in because we didn't know. So my first experience was, I came from a place of absolutely no knowledge at all and like no guidance. And it was very, very shocking to the system. I didn't even know like, what a house looked like or a storefront looked like or anything like that. So I don't think Alice is in exactly that same frame of mind, but there's still this way in which if you go to a place that's very unfamiliar, you have a heightened sense of detail, and I tried to capture that, showing her the detailed way that she figures out what's going on in the family, like that room she's in is sort of a storage room, so everybody keeps coming in all the time. That kind of thing wouldn't happen in an American house at all.
So much like Daisy, when Alice comes to India, she has it shocks her body, it shocks her mind. She does not understand why people are gawking at her the way they're gawking at her. And Ronit is, of course, overprotective because he knows that Alice doesn't understand what's happening. However, through their many wanderings and adventures, they finally land up in one of the places that they were supposed to be at. And therein we find the ghost that's transporting. This is a ghost that's moving across countries. But in this chapter, and I want to now touch upon your literary techniques and the way in which I found your book to be very unique, and I could resonate with some sections very personally. Because when Alice reaches India and she falls sick, she faints, there is a scene in which Daisy describes her sick in her room. And when you fall sick, it is a surreal thing. That is why we have a thing called fever dreams. And you describe this scene in which she hears words floating in. I'm just going to read a bit because I found it deeply connected with it. We all go through something like this. So Alice is sick and she's in her room. Lying in the adjoining room, Alice could hear Mrs. Ramsay's words as they floated into the semi-darkness where she lay. She felt utterly light, the roiling of her intestines like the sounds of some far-off storm that need be of no concern to her. She imagined the young Mrs. Ramsay. And then there is a scene in which she's imagining Mrs. Ramsay, and I will not read further because it would give away something huge. But I want to talk about this. Back in 2023, when you were here at the Jaipur Literature Festival, you were here talking about translation and translating. For those of you, I'm sure everybody knows, but Daisy Rockwell translated The Tomb of Sand, so she's a Booker Prize winner alongside Gitanjali Shri. Translation, however, as you said yesterday when we were speaking, you have a reason to do it. You have a story, and you are translating, and you are doing it naturally. When somebody asks you, why do you write fiction? You sometimes do not know, why do you write what you write? But what about your techniques? Because when you moved from a world of translation to now this world of fiction, while drafting up paragraphs like these, while bringing this world to life, what were some major changes that you saw in your thinking and writing process? And also, while you were writing this, for a lot of writers, when they ask you, what do we do? How do we become a writer? Are there times when you tell them that writing is not just about writing, it's also about remembering when you were sick and feeling this way? So tell us about those differences.
Yeah, I think that I always like to quote Lydia Davis, who's a famous translator. She translates French and other languages. But she also writes short fiction, and she always says that that with translations you never have the horror of the blank page, meaning you can wake up every morning and know that you still have that whole book to translate, and you'll do 5 more pages, and it's slow and arduous, and sometimes not any fun at all, and certainly not glamorous, but you know what you have to do. Whereas if you wake up in the morning and say, now I'm going to keep writing my novel, it's just like there's no boundaries, It's just so the blank page can swallow you up, and you could say anything, and I think that's very scary for a translator. So I have to try to create structures for myself, so like try to make outlines and things like that. But on the other hand, I also feel like when I'm translating, I'm drawing on myself, but like not deep into my psyche. Like I'm not allowed to just bring in anything that I've ever thought about. Whereas, so that's, sometimes it feels like that gets stopped up, and so writing fiction, I can just kind of pull out that stopper and like let the things that are all stored up. So I know a lot of people say you should keep a little notebook and write down the things that, like quotations and stuff like that. And I know that young people, like Gen Z people, such as my daughter who's 16, they record voice notes all the time. I don't know if you do that. Yeah. But you can also use your voice notes for, she wakes up every morning and tells her phone her dreams, and so she has them all stored up. So you can use these kind of notation systems to draw on things, but you can also just use your brain where these things are stored somewhere, and you just imagine and you channel that moment, and you think, I remember a moment when I was like feverish and I could hear people talking around me, and that disembodied sensations. You just have to channel your own experiences, and that can be very enriching, and especially because of all that time I spend translating and looking at other people's memories and other people's psyches.
Well, guilty as charged. Yes, I do that. I do send myself voice notes and then transcribe it. And in the morning, if I've had a dream, I would send it to myself as a message on WhatsApp in a voice note. But yes, you're right. It is about knocking at your psyche's door and bringing out that particular moment in time where you felt intense enough, and perhaps you don't recognize it at that point, but later on when you're writing and you're more haunted by the blank page than the ghosts that Alice sees, that's when you realize, oh, that is something I can write about. Another thing that I found interesting, and I would go back to when we have Alice meeting Ronit's parents for the first time, and then we'll go into Ronit a bit. You talk about Alice sharing her visions with the family, Ronit's mom and dad. This is the first time that she is meeting the parents of her to-be husband. And when she's telling the story of seeing ghosts, Ronit's dad, who is a very reserved person, and Ronit has always felt him a bit closed off, but he's a literature, he's a professor, and he has a literature backdrop. When Alice talks about the ghost, he asks her, so what does the ghost look like? And Alice starts describing the ghost, and Ronit's dad adds to the description. He says, is it sort of jumpy? Professor Roy repeated and stroked his chin, lost in thought for a moment. When I saw my father's ghost in the old house, he produced a similar effect. He was translucent. So they're talking about ghosts like everyday occurrences, much like people in ancient Mesopotamia who saw ghosts all the time. But I want to talk to you about this aspect again, the types of ghosts. I know that you're saying that you grew up with a certain image of a ghost and you grew up with these stories. Now, a translucent ghost in my mind is very Victorian. It brings to my mind very Victorian ghosts, unlike, in India where you have these churels with twisted feet and, with white sari-clad horrors. When you were thinking about the ghost, it is not a scary ghost. These ghosts are very, very cordial, and they have unfinished business, and they want things to do, but they do it very sweetly.
Sort of like what my mother promised me.
Yeah, exactly. So what was the image of the ghost that you were building on here? Because it is not a book for anybody who's scared of picking it up or wants to read it at night. You very much can. These are very sweet ghosts. So what was your imagination of the other world while drafting up the ghosts in the book?
Well, I think it was built on that memory from my mother, what she said that you should expect. And she herself, she died about 8 years ago, and she knew she was going to die. She had a brain tumor, so she knew she had just a few months to live. And she told us all that she would haunt us if possible. But she said it in a warm way, like, yes, I will come back and I will haunt you. Don't worry, I'll be back. And so, we haven't seen a translucent person, but that's what I imagined then too, that she would kind of show up and she would be non-corporeal, but we could kind of make her out. And, it's almost disappointing. Like, she had very strong opinions, and when you sort of imagine she'll show up when you do something she wouldn't like, and she's not there. So I think there's something comforting about thinking of a ghost still hovering around you and, still playing their part in your life.
I think
It's also a very stodgy ghost, this one. He's
yeah.
like a businessman. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, of course, ghosts have a sense of closure for those who believe in them or those who think that they have seen them, especially after moments that struck you with grief. The ghost that reemerges is calming in many ways, and I find that here too. But as I said in the beginning, the only skeptic in the book who we are keen on finding a convert in is Ronit, because for all his love for Alice, he still cannot convince himself that there is this other world that exists and it thrives, and that his entire family and his family to be sees it. But it is 160 pages in, for me at least, in the novel, where I think Ronit for the first time seems to be an excited character beyond Alice. And the context to this is that when they are in India, they chance upon a novel, and the author of this novel is connected to Alice. And Alice isn't that interested, but Ronit makes it his life's mission to find out this author and to locate him in the States when he goes back. What do you think it was about this particular novel, this particular incident, that excited Ronit particularly, that he comes alive and he's on this search, and in many ways now he seems to be a partner in crime to all of Alice's hunting of the ghosts and the family's history that she's on?
Well, this character, they found the book in the house where they were in Missouri, and I think it's like a tangible quest for him, because he knows that this was a real person who's probably still alive, who wrote this book that you can hold in your hand. And so it's almost like it gives him something to do while she's chasing the ephemeral. He can sort of say, all right, but let's look for a real person and locate this real person. And he's sort of fascinated because even though he's a man of science, he also, just like everyone else, reads a lot of literature. So he reads this whole novel, and he becomes kind of fascinated, and he wants to seek out this character. Yeah.
Another thing about the novel, the character of the mother, Claire, who is very disruptive, just generally throughout the book. You see her dealing with a set of issues. You see her going through alcoholism, and then after a certain incident in the book, you see her completely losing it, and Alice becoming the sort of family enemy. She's seen as that family enemy. When you were thinking of Claire's character, what was it that inspired you to give her this personality? And was Claire's disruptive attitude towards life the sole reason for Alice's reservation throughout her life, and how she crafts up her personality?
Yeah, I think that if one grows up around somebody with, basically Claire has a personality disorder, so she's alcoholic but also mentally ill. And if you grow up with somebody like that who's kind of, there's sort of an arrested development aspect too, then you have to keep yourself protected. And for me, because a part of my family is from this sort of crumbling New England aristocracy, there are a lot of people like Claire, because there was sort of these generations of ancestors that had lots of money and they built these big houses, and then slowly the money, and you see this also in the plot of this book, the money gets subdivided into ridiculously small amounts. And so there are people who can afford to never work and live off of these tiny amounts of money and maybe not even finish their education. And then they just kind of wander about thinking that they should have more, that there must be more that they could have. And so this is kind of the kind of figure that I've seen a lot of. And, you know, Alice herself didn't finish college. So like a lot of these people are uneducated and have spent most of their time wandering around these big houses reading very, very old books. And so it produces an odd type of psyche, I think. Yeah.
You know, we are going to these very small towns and places in Daisy's book. And one thing that kept recurring is Ronit in Alice's home and going to Alice's church. You bring out a lot of relevant ideas and themes in the book, be it from queer theory, where we see even Professor Roy, Ronit's dad, using it almost as a way to tell people, you know, you're safe around me and I know what we are up with. But at the same time, you also talk about the very real horrors of racism. You know, there are undertones, so there is never a moment where we see somebody being racist. They are not using words, but the way in which they are looking at you and the way in which they are saying to their partner, you know, he's brown, but he's well dressed, so perhaps it's okay. There are these undertones that are so prevalent. But, you know, Daisy, you are situating us in a very small town. However, we know that the time that we're living in, these undertones are becoming yet again global. Racial stereotypes, homophobia, and both of these themes that you deal with in the book. Was the political climate not only of these small towns, but of what's happening currently in America, globally, playing out in your mind? Because these undertones are, as I said, no longer reserved in these small spaces.
Right. I think there are a lot of Americans who like to think that they're not racist because it's all so subtle, you know, like, so it's nobody is saying screaming slurs or, you know, refusing someone entry into a restaurant or something like that. But there's just these subtle forms of disrespect or suspicion, and it's always simmering beneath the surface. And it's at times like now, presently, which is not being depicted in the book, but the present moment where it's just like exploding everywhere. And I think forcing people like these genteel racists who don't think that they're racist, I think it's forcing them to take a step back as well and think, okay, you know, you have to take a stand, and realizing that not racist involves a lot more than simply not saying rude things to people or doing violence to them, but that it involves putting yourself on the line. So yeah, things have changed, and they wouldn't be able to get away with these things now, I think. Yeah.
And there are these very tense moments in the book where you can read the tension, and I think rightfully so, because you need to confront that sort of tension and that sort of stereotype that exists. And even though this is not based in the times that we are in, it will speak to you because it does speak to the times that we are in from a supernatural political perspective.
Don't forget that the ghost is homophobic.
Yes, the ghost is also which is very odd, because usually I thought that the gays and the ghost would just get along, but here we see a very old school ghost. I think we need to open to the audience with just one last question, comment. You know, Daisy, you work at the intersection of art, of translating, of writing, now your own novel, your own imagination down in a book. While you were crafting this, how intersectionally were you operating? Because as we saw in the book, that the arts overall play such an important role, and they're not in silos. So the painter in you, the translator in you, and now the novelist in you, Do you see these as personalities in a silos, or are they all a part of you that sometimes gets a bit overwhelming when you're working and you do not know which part of your brain is activated? Was that a thing that you were writing this novel down?
Well, it's a sort of yes and no, and sometimes also sometimes I feel like these are all totally separate practices that I have to sort of put on a different hat or move to a different part of my house or go to a cafe or something to be able to change gears, and sometimes I can just flow back and forth. And I have another novel that hasn't been seen by anybody, which I had written quite a while back, but then I re-edited and changed it very dramatically. And I actually did insert some translation in it where there had been nothing of the kind, and gave it, the title is a bit of translation that I did. So there are ways in which these things can flow together, and then sometimes they seem to break apart. And I always wished that they would all just glom together, and that would be easy for me, because then I could just wake up and say, today I'll do work and it will be one thing, but it's not like that, so I have to keep sort of changing my disguises and finding, and also waiting for inspiration, because you never know where it will come from. And I was brought up by my parents to, I think if you're brought up by artists, you're taught to never lose that openness that small children have to creative expression. So a lot of people become insecure and self-conscious when they're about 10 or 11, and they stop drawing and they stop making art, and they say, I can't draw, I could never draw, and like I can't do anything creative. But if, you know, in my family, you would never be allowed to say that. If you said that, you would, like, there would be a lot of, you know, angry words, and it would be beaten out of you. Yes. So to me, it's like keeping a portal open. To be a creative person, you keep that portal from your childhood open, and you just allow things to, even if they're crazy, you just allow them to come out, and sometimes no one will ever see them, but they still have to come out, and you still have to express yourself.
And now you have a memoir on the way. How's that going?
Oh, that has actually been a lot of fun. It's called Our Friend Art, so it touches on what I was just saying. It's a bunch of vignettes, and it's a lot of artwork from my family, so it's mostly about my parents, who are both artists, and my grandfather, who was a famous artist, as I mentioned before, and what it was like growing up with them, and this kind of alternate reality that a bunch of artists can create, like you, because you kept remarking on this, that like there's just, everybody is only talking about art. Well, that's was my childhood was like that, and so I try to capture that, and I use a lot of our artwork, and I try to keep image and words balanced so that neither of them is in charge. So images are just as important as words in the memoir.
There's translation, there's novels, there's memoirs, there's paintings. Thank you, Daisy, for giving us so much to talk about. It's been a pleasure. We will now open to the audience if we have any questions from anybody. For Daisy, it could be, yes, we have a question over here.
What is the main message behind Alice Seen Ghosts?
The main message, I think the main message is, let's see, is there a main message?
She sees ghosts,
Okay,
and the ghost is homophobic.
Yes, the ghost
That's
is
my
homophobic,
message.
but he has some very practical financial matters to deal with. Yes, so I think the message is, if you see a ghost and he has, you know, some things he needs you to solve in terms of family annuities, then you should get on it.
The ghosts have unfinished business, and we need to make that finished business.
To finish it, and then they
Yes.
will go away.
Yes. Anybody else for a question? Yes, over there. And then over here in the front.
Thank you. This was very interesting. We've been hearing a lot today, several different panels about the limitations of the English language. And I wonder, as a translator, do you ever wish you could write in Hindi or Urdu to capture some more emotion or a different type of story?
Well, for this particular book, I would say no, because it's based on this kind of aspect of New England life, so it's a very English language part of my life. But I can see myself having that problem if I was setting something in somewhere in South Asia, and because I am so aware of the limitations of language and the beauty of certain words that can't be captured and without sort of pulling them apart.
Over here, and then over there.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for a great conversation. That was my question too, whether you would ever consider writing originally in Hindi.
I used to actually consider it all the time, and there are other authors who have written in not their native language and then been translated back. Most recently, Jhumpa Lahiri, who, not to throw shade, but my Hindi is probably better than her Italian. But anyway, I still am tempted because, I think that writing in a language that you didn't grow up with is another form of setting limitations that will be interesting to explore.
Over there, 2 questions.
There's obviously been many traditions of storytelling that have involved ghosts, like the Gothic stories and like many others, I'm sure. Do you see your ghost stories as having any kinship with any of these in particular, or repudiating the traditions of any one of these in particular?
Well, in some ways it repudiates it because this particular ghost is not scary. But in other ways, like the house is very much a sort of haunted house of the genre. And I think something we didn't really touch on is that some of the living people are in some ways more ghosty and more similar to a Gothic ghost than the dead people.
There's one more question over here.
I'm going to get my lozenge.
In other fiction that depicts ghosts or other forms of spectral creatures, are there any books or authors whose writing style or depiction of a ghost that you don't necessarily agree with?
Well, I think everybody is entitled to their own imagination about ghosts. I have recently been translating some Urdu horror where there are ghosts, and I think as a translator you get sort of deep into the way someone else writes, and I'm fascinated with how this author describes her ghosts, like what are the special qualities that they're supposed to have, and she's drawing both on the curates, but also like Nagina type things, but also on probably like Gothic English language literature as well. So it's like a heady mixture of all these, which I love.
Any more questions? We have time for just one more question. Okay, yeah, over there.
I'm sorry, I'm going to lead with a compliment from my 70-year-old mother. Dear Miss Rockwell, had the nonstop pleasure of reading Tomb of Sand, and it won't be an exaggeration to say that your translation has added a new dimension to the beat and rhythm of the narrative. I remain your big fan. She couldn't be here. She wanted me to read this to you. I also have a question related to this compliment about the alchemy between a writer and a translator. Do you ever feel like, I could have written this better, or the author's not doing enough? Like, what is that interaction like?
So first of all, thank you to your mother. That was very sweet. And yes, I think one of the big problems that translators of South Asian literature have is that many of these languages have very poor editing in them. So an author hands over their manuscript and then they throw it in the printer, and so there's a lot of books, even famous books, that have continuity errors and all different kinds of problems. And so, like, we don't talk about it, but I've decided to come out and talk about it recently because it's happened so much. We do edit a lot. And so it's not because we think we're better, the translators are better, but because a good book is an edited book. And English language publishing demands that things be edited and be smoothed out. And if she was wearing a green dress, she can't suddenly be wearing a white dress if there was no opportunity to change in the interim. So we do edit a lot. And so in that way, we sort of perfect things. Or, you know, sometimes there are parts of Ret Samadhi, for example, that are really hard to understand in Hindi. And so just in the process of me trying to understand it, it probably comes out more clearly in English because I had to figure out what she meant. So there are these ways in which things change, but it's not so much because we feel that we're better, because otherwise why would you pick the book to translate? You have to love it at the start. You know, you have to think it's important.
Thank you, Daisy. Thank you for all of your questions. It has been an absolute pleasure to speak about Alice's ghosts and everything under the ambit.
Thank you, Eric.
And Daisy and her ghosts will be signing copies of Alice's ghosts right outside. Thank you, everybody.